Hi, my friends. So today we're going to read chapters 14 and 15 of Mr. Popper's Penguins. I'm very curious to find out what happens. So let's start with chapter 14 and Mr. Greenbaum. Look here, said Mr. Popper at breakfast one morning. It says here in the Morning Chronicle that Mr. Greenbaum, the owner of the Palace Theater, is in town. He's got a string of theaters all over the country, so I guess we had better go down and see him. That evening, it was Saturday, the 29th of January, the Popper family and their 12 trained penguins, 2 of them carrying flags in their beaks, left the house to find the Palace Theater. The penguins were now so well trained that Mr. Popper decided that it was not necessary to keep them on leashes. Indeed, they walked to the bus line very nicely in the following line of march. So if you look, they're all nice and tidy in line. The bus stopped at the corner, and before the astonished driver could protest, they had all climbed on, and the bus was on its way. "Do I pay half fare for the birds, or do they go free?" asked Mr. Popper. "Jenny goes half fare, but I'm 10, said Bill. "Hush," said Mrs. Popper, as she and the children found their seats. The penguins followed in an orderly fashion. "Say, mister," said the driver, "where do you think you're going with this exhibit?" "Downtown," said Mr. Popper. "Here, let's call it 50 cents. And let it go at that." "To tell the truth, I lost count when they went past me," said the driver. "It's a trained penguin act," explained Mr. Popper. "Are they really birds?" asked the driver. "Oh, yes," said Mr. Popper. "I'm just taking them down to the palace to interview Mr. Greenbaum, the big theater owner." "Well, if I hear any complaints, off they go at the next corner," said the driver. "Fair enough," said Mr. Popper. He wanted to ask for transfers in that case, but decided to let well enough alone. The penguins were behaving very well. They were sitting quietly, 2 in a seat, while the other passengers looked on. "Sorry," said Mr. Popper, addressing everyone in the bus, "but I'll have to open all the windows. These are Antarctic penguins, and they're used to having it a lot colder than this." It took Mr. Popper quite a while to open the windows, which were stuck fast. When he had succeeded, there were plenty of remarks from the other passengers. Many of them began to complain to the driver, who told Mr. Popper to take his birds off the bus. He had to repeat this several times. Finally, he refused to take the bus any farther until Mr. Popper got off. By this time, however, the bus had got so far downtown that none of them minded having to get out into the street. Only a block ahead of them shone the lights of the Palace Theater. "Hello," said the theater managers. The Poppers and the penguins trooped past him. "Sure, Mr. Greenbaum's here in my office. You know, I've heard about these birds of yours, but I didn't really believe it." "Mr. Greenbaum, meet the Popper penguins. I'll be leaving you. I've got to go backstage." The penguins, now standing politely in 2 rows of 6 each, looking curiously at Mr. Greenbaum. Their 24 white circled eyes were very solemn. "All you people crowding around the door, go back where you belong," said Mr. Greenbaum. "This is a private conference." Then he got up to shut the door. The Popper sat down while Mr. Greenbaum walked up and down the double row of penguins, looking them over. "It looks like an act," he said. "Oh, it's an act, all right," said Mr. Popper. "It's Popper's Performing Penguins. First time on any stage. Direct from the South Pole, he and Mrs. Popper had thought up this name for the act." "Can we call them Popper's Pink-Toed Penguins?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Popper thought for a moment. "No," he said, "I'm afraid we couldn't. That sounds too much like chorus girls or ballet dancers, and these birds are pretty serious. I don't think they'd like it." "All right," said Mr. Greenbaum, "show me the act." "There's music to it," said Janie. "Mama plays the piano." "Is that true, madam?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Yes, sir," said Mrs. Popper. "Well, there's a piano behind you," said Mr. Greenbaum. "You may begin, madam. I want to see this act. If it's any good, you people have come to the right place. I've got theaters from coast to coast. But first, let's see your penguins perform. Ready, madam?" "We'd better move the furniture first," said Bill. Popper's Performing Penguins. At that moment, they were interrupted by the manager, who came in with a groan. "What's the matter?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "The marvelous Marcos, who closed the program, haven't turned up, and the audience are demanding their money back." "What are you going to do?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Well, give it to them, I suppose. And here it is, Saturday night, the biggest night of the week. I hate to think of losing all that money." "I have an idea," said Mrs. Popper. "Maybe you won't have to lose it, as long as it's the end of the program. Why don't we just have the Penguins rehearse in there on a real stage? We'd have more room, and I think the audience would enjoy it." "All right," said the manager. "Let's try it." So the Penguins had their first rehearsal on a real stage. The manager stepped out on the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his hand, "with your kind indulgence, we're going to try out a little novelty number tonight. Owing to unforeseen circumstances, the marvelous Marcos are unable to appear. We're going to let you see a rehearsal of the Popper's Performing Penguins instead. Thank you." In a dignified way, the Poppers and the Penguins walked out on the stage, and Mrs. Popper sat down at the piano. "Aren't you going to take off your gloves to play?" asked the manager. "Oh, no," said Mrs. Popper. "I'm used to playing with them, and I'll keep them on if you don't mind." Then she started Schubert's Military March. The Penguins began to drill very nicely, wheeling and changing their formation with great precision until Mrs. Popper stopped playing in the middle of the piece. The audience clapped vigorously. "There's more to it," explained Mrs. Popper. Half to the manager and half to the audience, where they form in a hollow square and march in that formation. It's so late, we'll skip that tonight and jump to the second part. "You're sure you don't want to take your gloves off, madam?" asked the manager. Mrs. Popper smilingly shook her head and began the Merry Widow Waltz. 10 of the Penguins now formed in a semicircle as Nelson and Columbus in their midst put on a wild sparring contest. Their round black heads leaned far back so that they could watch each other with both round wide eyes. "Gork!" said Nelson, punching Columbus in the stomach with his right flipper and then trying to push him over with his left flipper. And there they are, sparring. "Gah!" said Columbus, going into clinch and hanging his head over Nelson's shoulder. He tried to punch him in the back. "Hey, no fair," said the manager. Columbus and Nelson broke loose as the other 10 Penguins, looking on, applauded with their flippers. Columbus now sparred politely with Nelson until Nelson hit him on the eye, whereupon Columbus retreated with a loud "Ork!" The other Penguins began to clap, and the audience joined them. As Mrs. Popper finished the waltz, both Nelson and Columbus stopped fighting, put down their flippers, and stood still, facing each other. "Which bird won? Who's ahead?" shouted the audience. "Gook!" said all the 10 Penguins within the semicircle. This must have meant "look," for Nelson turned to look at them, and Columbus immediately punched him in the stomach with one flipper and knocked him down with the other. Nelson lay there with his eyes closed. Columbus then counted 10 over the prostrate Nelson, and again the 10 other Penguins applauded. "That's part of the act," explained Janie. "The other Penguins all like Columbus to win, and so they all say 'Gook' at the end. That always makes Nelson look away so Columbus can sock him good." Nelson now rose to his feet, and all the Penguins formed in a row and bowed to the manager. "Thank you," said the manager, bowing back. "Now comes part 3, said Mr. Popper. "Oh, Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "you forgot to bring the painting step ladders and the board." "That's all right," said the manager. "I'll get the stagehands to bring some." In no time at all, a pair of ladders and a board were brought in, and Mr. Popper and the children showed them how the ladders had to be set up with the board resting on top. Then Mrs. Popper began playing the pretty descriptive piece, "By the Brook." At this point in the act, the Penguins always forgot their discipline and got dreadfully excited. They would all begin shoving at once to see which could be the first to climb the ladders. However, the children had always told Mr. Popper that the act was all the funnier for all this pushing and scrambling, and Mr. Popper supposed it was. So now, with a great deal of squawking, the penguins fought and climbed the ladders and ran across the board in complete confusion, often knocking each other entirely off to the floor below, and then hurrying to toboggan down the other ladder and knock off any penguins who were trying to climb up there. This part of the act was very wild and noisy in spite of Mrs. Popper's delicate music. The manager and the audience were all holding their sides, laughing. At last, Mrs. Popper got to the end of the music and took off her gloves. "You'll have to get those ladders off the stage, or I'll never get these birds under control," said Mr. Popper. "The curtain is supposed to fall at this point." And there they all are, trying to climb the ladders and pushing and shoving. So the manager gave the signal for the curtain to go down, and the audience stood up and cheered. When the ladders had been taken away, the manager had 12 ice cream cones brought in for the penguins. Then Janie and Bill began to cry, so the manager ordered several more, and everybody had one. "I don't mind telling you, Mr. Popper, that I think you've got something absolutely unique in those birds. Your act is a sensation, and the way you helped out my friend, the manager here, shows that you're real troopers. The kind we need in show business. I'd like to predict that your penguins will soon be packing the biggest theaters from Oregon to Maine. And now, to come to terms, Mr. Popper," he continued, "how about a 10-week contract at $5,000 a week?" "Is that all right, Mama?" asked Mr. Popper. "Yes, that's very satisfactory," answered Mrs. Popper. "Well then," said Mr. Greenbaum, "just sign these papers and be ready to open next Thursday in Seattle." "And thanks again," said the manager. "Would you mind putting on your gloves again for just a minute, Mrs. Popper? I'd like you to start playing that military march again and let the penguins parade for a minute. I want to get my ushers in here to look at those birds. It would be a lesson to them." Okay, my friends, so there we have it. That's our reading for tonight. And tomorrow night we'll read 2 more chapters because I really want to finish this book. I'm very curious. And I bought us another read aloud for when we're done with the book because it's one of my favorites. So hopefully we'll get to read that on Friday and finish our chapters this week with Mr. Popper's Penguin, and you can take an AR test. Bye, guys. Love you.